Hello, Longhorns! It's Chuck Harris here with the Texas X's, and I want to welcome you to a brand new year of Lunchtime Lectures. Over the last year, it's been so encouraging to see people logging in from all around the country. So much so that we've decided to continue to do these lectures virtually. So, let's get to today's esteemed guest, Dr. Charters Wynn, an Associate Professor of History in UT's College of Liberal Arts. He's also Director of the Frank Denius Normandy Scholars Program on World War II. The lecture he has for us today is called Stalin's Russia at War, Victory at an Unimaginable Cost. We'll get to learn about the Soviet Union's decisive role in the Allied defeat of Nazi Germany, which cost more than 27 million Soviet soldiers and civilians their lives. Dr. Wynn has won numerous teaching awards, including the President's Associates Teaching Excellence Award and the Eyes of Texas Excellence Award. We're very excited to have him joining us today. Professor, they are all yours.
Well, thank you, Chuck, and welcome everyone, and thank you, Roxanne, for inviting me to give this lecture. So I'll begin by spending a few minutes talking about a UT program you've probably never heard of, but which Chuck just mentioned, before turning to the Soviet Union in the Second World War. The program is the Frank Denius Normandy Scholar Program on World War II, and which I've been one of its members for 20 years, and I've been its director for the last 10. Well over 600 students have participated in the Normandy Scholar Program since its first class in 1990. The Department of History program is unlike any other, not just at UT, but anywhere in the world. Each year, 20 of UT's top students from different backgrounds and majors, including students from the natural sciences as well as the liberal arts, spend a semester totally immersing themselves in a single subject, giving an intensive and comprehensive education on the causes, conduct, consequences, and contemporary representations of the Second World War. This program was established at UT 31 years ago by the Battle of Normandy Foundation in conjunction with Governor Bill Clements and UT President William Cunningham. Several years later, the generosity of the decorated World War II veteran and a veteran of the Normandy invasion, and the well-known UT philanthropist Frank Denius stepped in to keep the program afloat. The original goal of the Normandy Scholar Program was to help students remember the struggle and sacrifice of American troops during the Second World War. Well, that certainly remains central to the program. Over the years, there have been many changes in the Normandy Scholar Program. The main change is our broadening the focus to include the wartime experiences of civilians as well as soldiers, and even more importantly, to include the historical experiences of France, Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union. During the spring semester each year, the Normandy scholars all take the same 5 reading intensive and writing intensive courses. They consist of Professor Michael Stoff, teaches the United States in the Second World War. Professor Judy Coffin teaches France in the dark years. Professor David Crew teaches Hitler, Nazism, and World War II. And Professor Lichtenstein teaches Poland in the Second World War, while I teach Stalin's Russia at War. In addition to the 5 courses, there are weekly film screenings, which expose students to classics like Casablanca, as well as less well-known European films such as Come and See. There's also a guest lecture series, which in the past gave students opportunity to meet World War II veterans as well as Holocaust survivors. For these guest lectures now, we draw from faculty from across the university as well as members of the Austin community. After this demanding course of study during the spring, the program immediately heads off to Europe for nearly a month. Nothing brings history alive like discussing with students on the spot where it took place. While students originally traveled only to Normandy and Paris, we now go to Berlin, London, and Krakow as well. We visit battlefields, museums, monuments, and various other historical sites. One especially powerful day is when we walk for miles along Omaha Beach, where the D-Day invasion took place 77 years ago. And then we go up to the cliffs to the American Cemetery, where we give each student a yellow rose, that you can see here in the photo, and the name of a Texan buried there. All the visitors to the cemetery come to a stop as a recorded rendition of taps and the national anthem are played for our students. I still get choked up each year while I look out over the rows of marble Latin crosses and the Stars of David. Afterward, each student finds the burial site of their Texas veteran and spends some pensive time while placing the rose at their grave. Visiting Auschwitz outside Krakow, the largest and most notorious of the Nazi concentration and extermination camps, where over 1 million, mostly Jewish people, were murdered, is another especially unforgettable day. In London, we go to Churchill's War Cabinet rooms and the unmatched military museum, the Imperial War Museum. In Berlin, we visit such sites as the Reichstag and the enormous Soviet War Memorial in Treptower Park. In Paris, there aren't many World War II related historical sites, but how can the students go to France and not spend a couple of days in Paris? So we give them each a 2-day museum pass that gets them into all the museums in the city. Students invariably describe the Normandy Scholar Program as life-changing and the highlight of their time at UT. The intellectual and personal growth the program fosters has led directly to Normandy Scholar success at some of the top law schools, medical schools, and graduate programs in the country. You can go to the History Department website to read personal testimonies from past participants, such as the following one for one of last year's students. Quote, "The Normandy Scholar Program is wonderful and life-changing. Through this program, I've become a more thoughtful, analytical, and confident student. You meet some of your best friends in this program, bonded by the unique discussion, research, writing, and self-reflection that is omnipresent and unique to this program. The community and evolution of self that is found here can't be found anywhere else on the 40 acres," unquote. And this is from a student who, along with the rest of the students in last year's class, was deprived of the opportunity to go to Europe because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, now in broad brushstrokes, I will turn to Stalin's Russia at war. Please don't hesitate to post questions in the chat during my presentation. I plan to leave plenty of time for questions after my formal presentation. Let me say by way of introductory comments that each nation understandably views World War II through the prism of its own experience. Americans, as a result, widely believe it was the Western Allies who won the war, that the successful landing on the beaches of Normandy was the turning point of the war. Without minimizing in any way the courage and sacrifices of American and British troops during the war, there is no denying that it was the Soviet Union that was primarily responsible for defeating Nazi Germany, that it was on the Eastern Front where the Wehrmacht primarily lost World War II. By all measures, firepower, casualties, scale, the Soviet Union's war with Germany dwarfed the Allied campaigns in Europe and North Africa. Out of the total of 13.6 million German casualties, killed, wounded, missing, and made prisoner, 80%, some 10 million, met their fate on the Eastern Front. Without Soviet resistance, it is difficult to see how the democratic world could have defeated the new German Empire except by sitting tight and waiting until atomic weapons had been developed. But while the war turned the Soviet Union into one of the two superpowers during the Cold War, it was a catastrophe for the Soviet people, who suffered on a scale hard to comprehend even today. No war in history has produced greater human suffering and material deprivation than the campaign conducted by Adolf Hitler's Third Reich against Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union during World War II. But even so, the Soviet role in defeating Nazi Germany goes largely unrecognized even today. The Cold War certainly helps explain that. For example, Winston Churchill, despite writing during the war that, quote, "It was the Russians who tore the guts out of the German army," unquote, barely mentioned the war on the Eastern Front in his extremely influential 6-volume history of the war. Now let's turn to an overview of the war on the Eastern Front before returning to the horrible costs that this war entailed. The ultimate Soviet victory is all the more remarkable, given that it came after the truly catastrophic losses the country suffered during the first 2 years of the war. The Soviet Union was caught completely off guard by the attack on June 22nd, 1941, when the two largest armies ever assembled confronted each other along a 2,000-mile front, about as long as the distance between New York City and Miami. For months before the invasion, Stalin and the Communist Party leadership received ample evidence that Hitler was planning to attack, including at least 84 accurate warnings about the impending invasion from the American and British governments, as well as Stalin's own spies in Berlin and Tokyo. And that's, of course, Joseph Stalin in the image. Despite ominous movements of massive armed forces on the Soviet border, and 2 defectors from the German forces providing the exact date and time of the invasion, the Soviet dictator insisted Germany wasn't about to attack. Even after the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, Stalin wouldn't allow the Red Army to respond. And that was true for hours. The country paid a horrible price for concentrating so much power in the hands of a single, deeply flawed individual. As you can see in this photo, the Germans launched a 3-pronged attack that primarily targeted the 3 largest cities in the Soviet Union: Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Kiev in the south. Within just 1 month of the invasion, Germany occupied a chunk of territory more than twice the size of France. Soviet military losses for the first 6 long months of the war continued to be truly staggering. One single battle, the defense of Kiev, cost the Soviets over 500,000 men killed or missing. For every German who was killed during these first 6 months of the war, 20 Soviet soldiers died. Hitler's invading forces destroyed virtually the entire pre-war Red Army, killing, capturing, or maiming almost 6 million of its soldiers, wiping out its air force, destroying or damaging most of its weapons and equipment, and seriously damaging the faith of the leadership and the population that the country could ever achieve victory. And here's just some of the 3 million prisoners of war in the image. By December 1941, 6 months after the beginning of the invasion, Nazi forces were at the very gates of Moscow, within 15 miles of the Kremlin. But despite that, the shattered Soviet divisions, aided by fresh reinforcements from the eastern frontier and bitterly cold weather, achieved a stunning victory in the Battle of Moscow. The massive counteroffensive Stalin launched, despite the advice of his advisors and generals, initially had the German forces on the run. But while Stalin and the Soviet people hoped that this was the turning point of the war, for the Red Army, things got still worse in 1942, when German forces took the Soviet Union again by surprise by launching a major offensive in southern Russia that actually extends beyond what you can see on this map. They again achieved a string of victories over the Soviet defenders. At the end of August 1942, the German forces reached the Volga River, over 2,000 kilometers from Berlin. They entered Stalingrad in mid-September. At their farthest reach, the Germans occupied territory that stretched from Finland in the northwest to Turkey in the south. Beyond Stalingrad, there was nowhere left for the Soviet defenders to retreat. Now weeks of street-to-street, house-to-house fighting began. Every inch of Stalingrad was bitterly contested. The Soviets seemed to excel at this style of warfare. Then in the latter part of 1942, Soviet forces struck an unexpected and decisive blow in the German rear, closing a ring around 1/3 German troops trapped in Stalingrad. Following the disaster at Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht now fell back as rapidly as they had advanced. The Battle of Stalingrad shattered belief that the Germans were invincible, a belief that the disasters of 1941 and 1942 were shared by Russians as well as Germans. If Stalingrad wasn't the turning point of the war, then the Battle of Kursk certainly was. The Red Army defeated the Wehrmacht again, this time in what was the largest tank battle ever in history. After this immense battle at Kursk, which occurred in July 1943, the question was when would the Soviet Union defeat Nazi Germany, not whether it would. The Germans, though, remained a formidable force, for even in retreat, the German soldiers were as tough as ever. Soviet casualties continued to be extremely high as the Red Army continued to face the overwhelming bulk of the German army. There were 220 German divisions on the Eastern Front and only 30 divisions in Western Europe at the time of the D-Day landings in June 1944. Even later, during the Battle of Normandy, there were still twice as many Germans serving on the Eastern Front as in Western Europe. Right up to the end, in the first months of 1945, the Eastern Front retained its bitterly contested character. The Red Army suffered more than 300,000 casualties just in the final 2-week Battle of Berlin as German resistance to the Russians was frantic, even suicidal. Soviet Army's thirst for revenge was terrible, and the looting and rape on a massive scale following their defeat of Hitler's army and their occupation of Berlin and Eastern Germany. So that was a little overview of the war. So the question is, so how were the Soviets able to achieve this stunning victory over Nazi Germany? In the Soviet Union, while Stalin was still alive, the victory is almost entirely attributed to him. For a great many ordinary Soviet citizens, the propaganda image of the supreme military leader was all they knew. Stalin's successor, though, Nikita Khrushchev, harshly criticized Stalin's leadership of the Soviet Union, including his leadership of the war. But more recently, Stalin has been rehabilitated by Vladimir Putin. And I think it's fair to say, despite all of Stalin's initial mistakes, if he does deserve some of the credit for the ultimate victory, if nothing else because of his willingness to defer to his top generals, which Hitler never learned to do. Without Stalin, the efforts of the Communist Party, the people, and the armed forces would have become considerably less effective. In trying to explain the ultimate victory, historians also grapple with why the Soviet soldiers fought for a political system that had treated the population so horribly during the 1930s. The campaign to radically transform Russian agriculture was such an economic disaster that led to mass famine in 1932 and 1933 that took between 5 to 7 million Soviet lives, primarily in Ukraine. The so-called Great Terror in the later 1930s led to the arrest of over 2 million so-called enemies of the people, almost 700,000 of whom the police executed while sending the rest to work in the forced labor camps of the Gulag. Given all this, Hitler understandably thought all he had to do was kick in the door and the whole rotten structure would collapse. Why indeed would the Soviet people fight for such a regime? What is clear is that while in parts of the Soviet Union, the civilian population initially welcomed the invading forces as liberators, ultimately the regime was able to inspire people to fight. Much of the country supported the Soviet state's efforts to rally the population and were determined to defend the country against the German invaders. The memoirs of German generals and soldiers regularly speak of the Soviet troops offering fierce, almost suicidal resistance. A strong case can certainly be made that the fundamental reason why Soviet soldiers fought so fiercely was that their country was being subjected to a war of annihilation. While World War II was hell for just about everyone involved, the German occupation of the Soviet Union bore little resemblance to the occupation of Western Europe. Nazi ideology regarded not just Jews as racially inferior, it encouraged the Wehrmacht soldiers to view the Slavs also as subhumans. The Nazis would deport 4 million Soviet citizens to work in German industry and agriculture, where most of them were mistreated horribly. For those who remained inside the occupied territory, the German policy was one of total oppression and exploitation. The Nazi atrocities were a godsend to the Soviet state. The Soviet propaganda apparatus gave wide coverage to accounts and photos of atrocities. German troops' horrendous treatment of civilians and prisoners of war was cited most often by veterans as the primary source of their motivation to fight during the war. They were determined to defend their homeland and families, and Soviet soldiers generally fought well. And it should be noted, Soviet soldiers generally fought well. It was the rapid German maneuvering that caught so many prisoners of war. But it is also clear that what can be called the brutal Stalinist methods of war also played a crucial role in turning around Soviet fortunes on the Eastern Front. The unexpected and decisive victory in the Battle of Stalingrad owes much to the notorious Order 227, known as Not One Step Backwards. Stalin had concluded during the summer of 1942 that the severest measures were needed to maintain discipline and punish those who flinched in the line of duty. Any further retreat would not be tolerated. Stalin declared, quote, it is necessary to defend to the last drop of blood every position, every meter of Soviet territory, to cling to every shred of Soviet earth and defend it to the end, unquote. Order 227 greatly increased the number of blocking detachments. These units were made up of 200 men and women were set up behind the frontline troops and ordered machine gun down any Soviet troops who lagged behind or attempted to desert. How many Soviet soldiers were killed by the blocking detachments remains unclear. The latest Soviet estimates put the number at 158,000 men, including as many as 15,000 shot over a couple of weeks in Stalingrad. But the main point of Not a Step Backwards was not to punish offenders, but to defer waivers and to reassure those who were determined to stand and fight that any of their fellow soldiers who broke discipline would be caught and dealt with harshly. The order appears to have been generally supported by those serving in the front lines, helping to boost morale at a critical moment in the war. Unlike other orders, Order 227 was not published in the newspapers, but instead read out to every man and women in the Soviet armed forces. The savage conditions prevailing inside the Red Army were successfully concealed for decades because they did not fit with the post-war narrative of undivided Soviet heroism and self-sacrifice. While exceptional heroism of ordinary Soviet men and women did exist on a massive scale, Order 227 and other similarly draconian measures certainly played a role in turning the tide on the Eastern Front. Nearly 1.5 years before the June 6, 1944 landing of the Western Allies in the beaches of Normandy. The Soviet victory was remarkable, not only because the country lost so many soldiers. German forces also inflicted colossal economic losses, as did the Soviet scorched earth policy, in which Red Army troops destroyed so much built at great cost during the 1930s. Yet the Soviet Union proved able, already by the end of 1942, to outproduce Germany in military hardware. This was due to the Soviet leadership's decision during the very first days of the war to begin to evacuate industry from actual and potential war zones to the rear areas of the country. And as you can see in this image, to the Urals, Siberia, Central Asia, and other areas in the East. 2,593 enterprises, including 1,523 large-scale factories, were relocated, which constituted some 80% of the Soviet war industry. The evacuation required some 1.5 million railway wagons and the evacuation of some 25 million workers and their families to reassemble the factories and then work in them. What other country could have forced 25 million people to move, sometimes on foot, while under constant bombardment from the air, to places short of food and often without any housing at all? Certainly the United States could not have done that. Already by mid-1942, more than 1,200 of the evacuated enterprises have been restored to producing fantastic amounts of weapons, tanks, airplanes, ammunition, and other supplies of war. The Soviet Union's most celebrated World War II general, Grigory Zhukov, wrote that, quote, "The heroic feat of evacuation and a restoration of industrial capacities during the war meant as much for the country's destiny as the greatest battles of the war," unquote. It was indeed the most stupendous and successful such operation ever carried out. World War II in the Soviet Union was a total war. The 66-hour work week became the norm, with only 1 day off a month. Vacation and leaves for workers were canceled. Compulsory overtime was introduced. In addition, the entire population was mobilized. Men to the front, women to the factories was a familiar slogan during the war. Women made up over half the factory workforce. The other half were workers were young boys or old men. Of the country's farms, women accounted for almost 3/4 of the labor force. The economy was treated as if it was also a battlefield. While the government appealed to patriotism, it did not hesitate to treat absenteeism and lateness like desertion. Repeated offenses meant the gulag. And these images should have moved forward a little bit. So here's Soviet women in military production. And so now I'll turn to the role of Lend-Lease. A particularly contentious issue is the significance of American aid to the Soviet victory. During World War II, the United States shipped an enormous amount of aid to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. During the Cold War, I think it is fair to say that the Russians minimized its impact and the West exaggerated it. While it is obviously impossible to know exactly what would have happened without the aid, it is clear that Lend-Lease came too late to be a decisive factor in the war, or the decisive factor. During the most crucial battle period of the war on the Eastern Front, the aid remained little more than a trickle. It was only following the Soviet victory in the Battle of Stalingrad at the beginning of 1943, as I've said, the Soviet Union's eventual victory seemed virtually assured, that American aid began to arrive on a massive scale. 85% of the aid arrived after the beginning of 1943. But it was equally clear that when aid began to arrive on a massive scale, it greatly improved the Soviet Union's ability to conduct the war. Lend-Lease significantly increased the speed with which the German army was pushed out of the Soviet Union. Without the aid, the Soviet people would have had to make even greater sacrifices and suffer even more deaths. Finally, on this point, it is ironic that although the Soviet Union would have won the war on the Eastern Front without Lend-Lease, American aid, which included, for example, 363,000 Chevrolet, Ford, Dodge, and Studebaker trucks, facilitated the Red Army's arrival in Eastern Europe for the Anglo-American forces, which set the stage for the beginning of the Cold War. And it should be noted, as you can see on the chart shown, that Great Britain received 3 times as much Lend-Lease as did the Soviets. The sheer scale of the Soviet-German war and the extent of the sacrifices it demanded of the Soviet people is hard to comprehend, because we in the United States have never faced anything even remotely like it. Until fairly recent, we did not know the full scale of the Soviet sacrifices. Basic questions such as the total military and civilian losses suffered by the country, the number of Soviet POWs who died in German captivity, couldn't be answered until Gorbachev's rise to power and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Till Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union gave the number of Soviet deaths as about 7 million. Khrushchev later upped that figure to 20 million, a number many scholars thought was inflated. But it is now commonly accepted among historians that 25 to 27 million Soviet soldiers and civilians lost their lives as a result of the war. Over 35 million troops fought in the war, which included some 800,000 to 1 million women, half of whom were in frontline units. An incredible 84% of these 35 million soldiers in the Red Army, more than 4/5, would be killed, wounded, or captured by 1945. At least 11.4 million Soviet soldiers were killed in action or died in German POW camps. Another 18 million suffered serious wounds or illnesses, often multiple times. In stark contrast, roughly 400,000 American troops died in World War II, in the Europe and Pacific theaters combined. The United Kingdom, as you can see in this chart, suffered a comparable number of military deaths. The Soviet Union suffered such enormous losses because the German army was able to launch a surprise attack, as we've seen, but also because of the attitude of the Soviet Union's political and military leaders, who displayed a callous disregard for human life. The Soviet command often sought to win a battle at any cost, rather than win it without suffering unnecessary losses. The history of the Soviet war offers numerous examples of soldiers killed because of ill-prepared offensives that lacked the necessary logistical support and ended in retreat and enormous losses. The most egregious example of this disregard for losses is embodied in the punishment units. In the most difficult and dangerous sectors of the front, penal battalions were used. It was easy to end up in a penal battalion because of an incautious word, criticism of the actions of the command, or even a joke. During the course of the war, the ranks of these penal battalions were also filled with hundreds of thousands of prisoners from the Gulag. A total of 442,000 people in the end were forced to serve in these battalions, which were typically sent on suicidal missions through minefields ahead of the regular troops. They could be reinstated into the regular army only if they were wounded, if they had quote-unquote atoned with their blood. Few of the great number who served in penal battalions could have survived, but there is no way of knowing exactly. Historians for a long time did not fully appreciate what a catastrophe the war was for Soviet civilians. It is true that the civilian losses were at least twice the number of military deaths. During the 3.5 years the Germans occupied Soviet territory, the best estimate suggests 17 to 19 million civilians perished before their time. Whatever the precise number, there is no dispute that Soviet population suffered out of all proportion of the sufferings of the Soviet Union's allies and enemies, and suffered in most cases not a relatively quick end from a bomb or a bullet, but an agonizing death from starvation. Of all the wartime hardships suffered by the Soviet population, malnutrition stands out as the most pervasive. While many people experienced violence, injury, and homelessness, almost all civilians went hungry, lost weight, grew weaker, and became vulnerable to illnesses of all kinds. The largest concentration of civilian deaths was in Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, which German forces surrounded and then imposed a blockade that lasted nearly 2.5 years. Around 1 million people slowly, painfully, tragically died of hunger and disease, of hunger and hunger-related illnesses during the siege of Leningrad. The 1 million people who died in Leningrad in this single city exceeds the total number of American deaths as a result of war in our entire history. In addition, the so-called global loss of the Soviet population, the difference between the population after the war and the population that it should have been had the war not taken place, may be as high as 49 million people. And these figures do not include the invisible legacy of war, which we only really recently have come to recognize, the psychological casualties, the victims afflicted by post-traumatic stress disorders. Thus, while the USSR turned into one of the world's two superpowers during the Cold War, the Soviet people suffered during the war on a scale hard to comprehend. The Great Patriotic War, as is known in the former Soviet Union, left its mark on virtually every family and community. At the end of the war, the victorious Soviet Union was at least as devastated and impoverished as Germany and Japan. An extraordinary catalog of losses: 70,000 villages, 1,700 towns, 32,000 factories, 40,000 miles of railroad track. Just to go on, I could go on, obviously, in other categories, all lay in ruins. Over 1/3 of Soviet wealth was destroyed. Some 25 million people were homeless. To conclude, although they obviously knew the future would be difficult, Soviet people seemed to believe that the regime would reward them for the sacrifices, that the regime in gratitude for their sacrifices, the regime in gratitude would continue the liberalizing trends introduced during the war, which I didn't have time to talk about today, but the liberalized policies towards the church, towards intellectuals, various other things. But for Soviet heroes who thought that they had earned the right to a less repressive society, there would be no GI Bill, no post-war prosperity. Stalin had other plans in mind, but that is a subject for another day. And with that, I conclude my formal presentation and look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Wynn. This is Patricia Shampton, Director of Alumni Relations for Texas Exes and one of the moderators. We do have a couple of questions coming in that, if you're okay, I'll just read these to you and you can answer them.
Sure.
So we've got a couple about Ukraine. So one is, did the evacuation of industry from Ukraine result in a permanent deindustrialization of that republic that continues to today? Or did some industries eventually return to Ukraine post-World War II?
Good question. It's in eastern Ukraine, the industrial part of Ukraine that's been contested recently by the Soviets' proxy war there. They often rebuilt both in Moscow and Leningrad and in Ukraine on the places where the factories were before. So that wasn't so much they return them there. Also in Ukraine, it's the kind of coal mining center of the country. Obviously, you can't move mines, but that remains an important industrial part of Ukraine today.
Cool. Also, there was a question about Ukraine. Did they end up supporting the German invasion? Did they join the German army?
There were some who did, and there were others who collaborated with the Germans, and that has been a source of tension over the decades. Ukrainians, though, also fought to push the Germans out of Ukraine. One other aspect of the war that I might have touched on is the role of partisans, kind of a resistance movement that emerged during World War II. And one of the primary goals of these partisan units, in addition to kind of disrupting German supply lines and other things, was to track down people who were collaborating with the Germans and provide an example of what, if you collaborate with the Germans, you might get attacked in the middle of the night. But Ukrainians helped carry out some of the mass atrocities, the mass killings of Jews in Ukraine. So, but as I mentioned during the talk, I mean, they had suffered so horribly under the Soviet regime as a result of the famine of 1932, 1933, when the Soviet Union attempted to introduce what was known as collectivization, forcing peasants to give up independent farming and join these collective farms, which they bitterly resented and resisted, and partly perhaps in retaliation for that, when they became clear that they were suffering from massive hunger, Stalin prevented aid from going to the region. So the tensions between Ukraine and Russia during the Soviet period were certainly intense.
Thank you for that. It's just something that I had not been exposed to, so that's pretty interesting. In that same sort of context, when Germany conquered France, a portion of the French population welcomed them, in part due to their affinity for anti-Semitic sympathies. Were there any indications that was maybe a similar motivator for Soviet citizens that welcomed the Nazi invasion, or at least those first German troops?
Well, again, in Ukraine, or in the Baltics for that matter, part of been incorporated into the Soviet Union as a result of the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. So they were only recently part of the Soviet Union. But there is a long history of anti-Semitism, certainly in the Russian Empire. There were horrible pogroms during the Tsarist era. And there was certainly anti-Semitic sentiment in parts of the country. And partly in Ukraine, but also in the Baltic states, because, and this goes back to the end of the 18th century when Poland disappeared from the map and part of the eastern part of Poland was incorporated into the Russian Empire. That is where a lot of Jews lived. And you may have heard the phrase, the Pale of Settlement, or the Pale. Russian Jews were required to live in this Pale of Settlement. And so in these areas, there were tensions over the years between the Jewish population, which wasn't allowed to farm. So we're in these roles of middlemen and the rest of the population. But certainly anti-Semitism plays a role in the collaboration of some of the citizens of the former Soviet Union. They would take over the homes of the Jews that were killed or escaped, and when they returned, would often be beaten. It's a complicated but horrible story.
We've got a couple of questions about Lend-Lease as well. So, without Lend-Lease, would there have been differences in the conclusion of the war?
Well, as I mentioned in my talk, and I'm just looking for the book I had set aside that was going to read off the numbers. But Lend-Lease does provide an enormous amount of aid. But as I suggested during the talk, I don't think it would have changed the outcome on the Eastern Front. I think the Soviets were going to win that war already before Lend-Lease began to arrive in a significant amount. But the amount of aid was truly stunning in its amounts. Although the Soviets like to say that only 4% of all of their military supplies came from Lend-Lease. And they also often emphasize that their tanks were superior to the American tanks, which they certainly were. But as I mentioned, there was some 330,000 trucks 363,000 trucks that came in to the Soviet Union. There were 43,000 Jeeps. So the Soviets didn't need to spend their time building Jeeps. Some 380,000 field telephones, some 15 million boots. I mean, the Soviet soldiers are walking in American-produced boots, 2.5 million belts. I could go on and on. So I think it does really allow the Soviets to move much more quickly into Eastern Europe and push the Germans out of Soviet territory and move into Eastern Europe, which, as I suggested in the talk, sets the stage for the tensions over Poland as the Soviets, occupy these countries of Eastern Europe, and they may not have been able to do so if it hadn't been for these Lend-Lease supplies that made them a much more mobile force than they had been before. So Lend-Lease, I think, was significant and was appreciated and reduced some of the sacrifices, because in addition to all these military supplies, it was also food that was brought in, canned meat. There was 782,000 tons of Spam and other kinds of canned meat were sent to the Soviet Union. And despite the horrible sufferings of hunger and starvation that I mentioned in the talk, it would have been even worse without this aid from the United States.
And then we've got a question about Robert, kind of following up. It's a little bit of a similar question. He mentions that he was unaware, and so am I, of the role that the Chinese played. So did that result in a large number of Chinese casualties? And can you talk about the Chinese involvement just a little bit more?
Well, I mean, it's Japan that's fighting this war against China. And as you saw, the number of Chinese casualties was enormous as well, not quite on the scale of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, at the very end of the war, before America knew that the atomic bomb would work, had agreed to join in the invasion of Japan, and were actually moving into Japan just as the bomb was dropped for the second time and the war came to a close. But they otherwise they don't really play a role in the Far East. Something I mentioned just very quickly was in the Battle of Moscow, the decision was made that Japan was not going to join with Germany and attack the Soviet Union. From its spies, it learned that they were going to instead focus on the United States and send their forces to Pearl Harbor, and that allowed the Soviets to bring these troops from their own eastern front back to Moscow and help play a central role in repelling the Germans from actually taking the capital city. And what would have been the effect on morale and whatever if Moscow had fallen? It looked so bad in the middle of October that they evacuated much of the bureaucracy 700 miles to the east to a city along the Volga River, Kuibyshev.
So I'm going to kind of switch to the German side of this conversation for just a second. And do you think the outcome would have been meaningfully different had the German army not pursued the symbolic Battle of Stalingrad and instead just took the oil fields of the Caucasus, or concentrated on just winning the ground war?
Well, that's often been suggested, that this was a fatal mistake to divide the forces, half of them going to Stalingrad and the other half going to the oil fields of Baku. But it should be noted that the Soviets were going to destroy those oil fields before the Germans arrived. And there were plans also to just basically dynamite much of Moscow if the Germans actually looked like they were going to be able to take the city. So I don't know. I think the Germans' decision to delay the invasion because of the Italian problems in the Balkans, and not attack until June 22nd, it really hurt their chances of victory. As you all probably have some sense of, winter comes early in the Soviet Union, in Russia, and to wait until the end of June instead of attacking, say, in May, I think really hurt their chances. German generals like to blame the winter or the heavy rains that precede the winter during the fall. In Russia, the rains come in the heaviest in the fall rather than the spring, which would obviously be better for agriculture. But it's not as if that wasn't known. I mean, and so when the Germans blamed the winter, well, yeah, but you obviously should have taken that into consideration when you decided to attack. And going back to Stalin's why he refused to heed these warnings, I mean, partly he was convinced that if they hadn't attacked until the end of June, they weren't going to attack, that they realized too that would be a fatal mistake. They basically attack at the very same time Napoleon did, and basically have the same sort of outcome, as happened to Poland. But Stalin's refusal to heed these warnings, and they even included a reconnaissance flight, that crashed, that had photography equipment on it, taking photographs of key railroad junctions and other sites. But Stalin refused to think that Hitler would actually attack, at least until he defeated Great Britain. He thought that Stalin understandably thought Hitler would not want to fight a two-front war, but he thought he could quickly defeat the Soviet Union and then Great Britain would ultimately just more or less surrender. But obviously that is not what happened.
Yeah. And here's another question from Juan, specifically about Germany. What was Germany's strategic objective after Typhoon? Was it the AA line? And do you believe that reaching this was feasible for the Wehrmacht?
Well, their ultimate goal was to destroy Leningrad and Moscow, turn Moscow into a lake, build their new cities, force all the population except those necessary to do the most menial tasks beyond this to the Far East, and basically allow them to starve to death. So this was, as I tried to emphasize, just unimaginably brutal policies by the Germans towards the Soviet civilian population. But they saw no future in their conquered Russia for Slavic citizens other than just doing the most menial tasks. And certainly intellectuals would have been rounded up and executed. I mentioned during the talk that Soviet POWs suffered these enormous losses. The Soviet Union during the first months of the war had 3 million of its troops captured and became prisoners of war. Ultimately, 5 million would be captured. And unlike the way they treated American or British POWs, they were just put in these big pens and basically allowed to starve to death. And so some 3 million of those 5 million starved to death before the Germans appreciate that they could, as things turn for the worst on the Eastern Front, that they should use some of those prisoners of war for manual labor of various sorts. But again, it's just this war of exploitation and annihilation that's really bears little resemblance to what happened on the Western Front. You mentioned, French collaborating with the Soviets. They did, and there was a resistance movement, but resistance movement was nothing compared to the resistance movement in the Soviet Union. But they also life was a little worse, but they could continue to go to French restaurants and etc. I should also note that in the United States, the period of the war for American civilians was actually a great time. The war pulled the United States out of the Depression. Consumer goods were available in a way they hadn't been before. Jobs were well-paying jobs were available in the new in the military production industries. So again, the Soviet experience was so dramatically different from the experience of the Western Allies. Of course, the British were bombed, but Moscow, for example, was bombed much more heavily than London, just to give one example.
And here's a follow-up kind of question. You've hit on this in various points in your lecture, but Annika asked if you could elaborate just a little bit further on, Stalin failing to reward his people for their sacrifices that they made during the war. I mean, why would he withhold incentives after they fought on his behalf? Is there additional information you can share there?
Well, he was determined to rebuild the Soviet Union and rebuild it in the same sort of way with this emphasis on heavy industry, and to de-emphasize even more than they had before the war consumer goods. And so it was a determination to just return to the way things had been before. As I noted, many people thought that some of these policies, such as really liberalizing policies towards the church, would be continued after the war. Churches were allowed to remain open, but only a small percentage of them. There just was. They also, arguably, we're not in the position to offer the kinds of benefits that the United States offered GIs after the war. Although they were celebrated on Victory Day, which is the anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany. You would see on the streets of Moscow when I was there, these veterans walking around with their enormous chests full of medals. The Soviet Union was very liberal in giving out medals. Then they had a few benefits. There were certain tables like cafeterias that were just for veterans, but nothing like what American veterans who come back from the war and buy a house with very low interest rates and go to college being paid for, etc.
Well, we have time for one more question, and it's it's a comment and a question at the same time. So the comment is, it's really refreshing to hear what I personally consider a realistic view of a country that really primarily helped win World War II, but so many Americans do not realize or credit the Soviets. Have you seen this view changing over the years, or expect that it might?
Well, I don't know. Maybe you saw Ken Burns's celebrated video series, film series entitled "The War," just a few years ago. And what happened on the Eastern Front was just this little backdrop to what was happening that was focused on during this film series. So I don't know. I'm often surprised at how even very knowledgeable people, even sometimes speaking from the State Department, seem to not fully understand what happened on the Eastern Front. So it's as I suggested, it was a casualty of the Cold War. The United States goes from being an ally with this country, downplaying the horrors of the Soviet system. And you might be, there's a film series entitled Why We Fight that came out during the war. And I just had the students watch the segment on the Battle of Russia. And the whole emphasis of this film series was to suggest that the Russians were just like us, that they had this history of fighting back in fighting well in wars, no emphasis on the nature of the government or the leader of the country. Although during the war, Stalin was referred to as Uncle Joe, and really, was kind of downplayed the horrors of the system. But then, as I mentioned, with the Soviet forces occupying Eastern Europe and creating the Eastern Bloc, as it became known, that view of the Soviets' contribution to the war increasingly was downplayed. So few people have any sense that the Soviet people, some 27 million Soviet citizens lost their lives during the war. We all presumably know about the Holocaust, but which part of that Holocaust took place on Soviet territory. But the sense to which the Soviets suffered during the war is, as the title suggested, almost unimaginable. Just one final point. I mean, from 1914, with the beginning of World War I, until the end of 1942, some 50 million Soviet citizens died as a result of war, civil war, this famine I mentioned, the Great Terror, and the majority of World War II. So what the Soviet people suffered during the first half of the 20th century is truly, to me, unimaginable.
Yeah, me too. I mean, this was eye-opening. And first off, thank you, Dr. Wynn, for agreeing to take over our January lunchtime lecture. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with Texas Exes today and discuss the Soviet Union's role in World War II. We learned lots of information. Thank you really for your time. And it was a pleasure speaking with you. And thank you to our wonderful audience for taking part in our first lunchtime lecture of 2021. Like our executive director said at the beginning of the event, we've seen great success with our virtual lectures, and we plan to continue to host these events online in the future. And speaking of the future, our February lecture is scheduled for Thursday, February 18th, with Professor Juan Miro from the School of Architecture. His lecture, Building a New Arcadia, will explore how architecture has reshaped Austin's identity as a creative hub. And you can find out more information on all the lunchtime lectures at texasexes.org/lunchtime lectures. And again, thank you everyone for joining us, and y'all have a wonderful week.